announced in this morning's bulletin, West End's new pastor, Tim Cheprasoff, is coming to join us in August. And so my ministry among you is drawing to a close 4 weeks from today. So for this last week of messages, I want us to look at Christian ministry. Ours, mine, yours, and maybe even Tim's. And that's why I've called this message, Our Ministry, My Ministry. I'm hoping that you might look at that title and think, as you say it to yourself, so how does my ministry fit into the wider ministry? How does your ministry fit into the ministry of the whole church? How can we work together as Christians to most effectively be God's people in this place? Our Bible focus for this morning and to begin this series is from Acts chapter 6. This brief section, I think, has important things to say to us here at West End at this time in our life together. And the account in Acts 6 starts with good news and bad news. The good news is that in those days, the number of the disciples was increasing. The church was growing. People were coming to trust in Jesus, to be baptized, to join the church. They were keen to serve and keen to witness to Jesus. They had a sense of unity among them. You can read about that in the previous chapters of the book of Acts. And it was good news. With the good news of the gospel, the good news of the church was that they were working together and things were moving forward for God. The bad news is that one group among them was complaining against another group. There was factionalism there. People had drawn up sides. They had listened and decided for or against somebody's complaint. The church wasn't perfect. I think it's important for us to realize that. Sometimes we idealize the first century church. But it wasn't perfect. It was a church like ours that isn't perfect. We need to remember, and you can see this too as you look back in the first, especially in Acts chapters 3 to 6, you can see that the enemy of God was sowing discontent. There was trouble in that church, and they had to deal with problems from time to time. The groups had drawn up sides, and one group was complaining against another group. The complaint was about ministry and finances and injustice. And to that early church's credit, they took the complaint seriously, and they found a wise solution. I think it's fair to say that these past 3 years that I've been with you have been good ones for West End. I don't say that in my own praise, but I came to a healthy church, I think, and it's healthy still. We've been growing a little. We've certainly been growing in terms of the numbers of people that we've added to the fellowship. Oh yes, there have been others that we've waved goodbye to, people who've moved away or left us for one reason or another. But we've welcomed newcomers, we've taught the faith, we've baptized new Christians, we've started new ministries. Established ministries have continued strongly and have flourished. And when there has occasionally been a complaint or a conflict, we've dealt with it, I think, and found ways to move forward. That's a part of the way it is in any church, hopefully. There will always be good news to be reported, and there will always be challenges to face, difficulties and conflicts. But it's important for us, as we work together, to face those conflicts reasonably and to choose ways that we could work together that would promote the good of the church. I was excited to discover when I came in the second week of September that there was an Alpha course beginning. And I was kind of thrown into it and was glad for how many people were involved, upwards of 50 people. Just a marvelous experience. And there were just a wide variety of people around the tables, committed Christians who were mostly leaders at that Alpha meeting. There were others who were kind of new in the faith, who were helping out and just trying their wings in leadership. There were others who weren't Christians at all, people who were curious and just answered the poster and the invitations that people had given them and came to have a bite to eat, a supper together, to watch a video, and to talk together about that. And people found it to be a non-threatening experience. We're going to do it again, perhaps as soon as this fall. But it's a church. This is a church, I believe, that is healthy and growing, that's dealing with conflict well, that's well organized for its mission. We have boards of trustees and deacons. We have committees that look after Christian education and the social committee and finance and all the rest, a whole variety of groupings that help us, and those groups are working well. It will always be that the church is like the church of Acts chapter 6. And so let's move on from that. The specific problem that this Jerusalem church faced is not described in too much detail. But the solution they came up with and how they decided can teach us a lot. The Jerusalem church was comprised almost entirely of Jews who had believed in Jesus as the Messiah. They had all changed their minds significantly recently because of Jesus, who had just been among them. Jesus had a Jewish background himself. He grew up in a Jewish family. His heritage was the Old Testament heritage that you can read about. And he arose and focused his ministry within a Jewish context, within that area just near the Mediterranean Sea, where those people who had a similar background, a similar heritage, a similar book to read, and the same God to worship, were in a common milieu with them. And when Jesus came saying that yes, he was the Messiah, the hoped for deliverer that the Old Testament had predicted, they believed in it. They trusted Jesus for that. They saw the fulfillment of the Old Testament. They saw the scriptures measuring up to, they saw Jesus actually measuring up to what the scriptures had predicted and prophesied. And they believed in him. They recognized that his death on the cross was a sacrifice like the Old Testament ones, but a definitive and final sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. And they recognized that in the resurrection of Jesus, there was God's vindication of that sacrifice, his stamp of approval on what had happened. And an even larger message that those who trust in Jesus not only have their sins forgiven, but receive the same kind of new life that Jesus did when he was raised from the dead. See on YouTube or our website the last 4 or 5 sermons that I preached about 1 Corinthians 15 and how we inherit that tremendous gift that was given to Jesus, first of all, to rise to new life and never die again. You and I will experience that too. So those Christians in Jerusalem all had that same Jewish background. But what they didn't share was a common language. Now that's interesting. They didn't share a common language. Most of them were Aramaic Jews or Hebraic Jews who spoke Aramaic, the same language that Jesus spoke. Aramaic was kind of a derivative or a nephew of Hebrew, quite similar. And Jesus spoke that language. They spoke that language too. when they would meet to worship God and to praise Jesus and to tell the stories that would eventually become the Gospels, they spoke and listened and sang in Aramaic. But there were others who had been influenced by the Roman occupation of Israel that had gone on for quite a few decades by then. There were other Christians in that early Jerusalem church who spoke Greek. That was the language of business and the language of the government, and so there was a huge pressure to be able to speak that language. Some spoke Aramaic and some spoke Greek, and it was not unexpected that they might become two different groups within the same church, even though they had Jesus Christ in common, even though they were equally excited about the wonderful things that had just happened to them with the resurrection and ascension of Christ. Still, when they went to coffee after church, one of them went to that side of the room and one of them went to that side of the room. Some of them, they just kind of naturally talked to the people who spoke their language, who shared their background. And even if they could speak both languages, which some of them did, I'm pretty sure, they would choose one group or the other to identify with. And then one group complained. We're not being treated fairly here. We're being disadvantaged in the daily distribution of food. Our widows, those Greek-speaking believers said, our widows are being overlooked in the church's urban ministry program. Okay, so we have a problem here. In the Jerusalem church, they had a situation. Let's step back from that a minute and look at it and then think about how our church measures up to that. It's to their credit that they were caring for their poor. That's the first thing to say. It was the hallmark, in fact, of the early church that they looked to the ones that didn't have enough resources and replenished those resources for them. People helped others. We were poor once, comparatively very poor, in fact, with the church that we attended. And we knew what it was like to be the recipients of the charity of others. It's a tricky situation to be in. It's a tricky situation for the givers as well as the receivers. We remember one time, it was just before Christmas, and the pastor of our church came and with one of the deacons and said, we've just finished the distribution of food, Christmas hampers, and we had one left over and we thought of you. And we gladly received that gift. Katharina can tell you how many few pounds we had in the bank at the time. It was something that the church did, and it's something the church continues to do, and it's something that we at West End do. Most of that, we care for the poor. We do that through our weekly program called Urban Ministry, when 20 to 30 people come and receive gift cards, and even more importantly, receive kind of a regular connection with volunteers who have done this ministry for quite a few years, who get to know the people who come and who make a difference in their life, add a word of encouragement, add an extra gift at Christmas time, add the opportunity, and take advantage of opportunities to make a difference in their lives. We also do lots of work for the poor through our Deacons Benevolent Fund. Every month on Communion Sunday, like this, you have an opportunity to make an extra offering, to jot down a donation, perhaps on your envelope, to the Benevolent Fund. And unheralded, but consistently, this fund does an enormous amount of good. $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year spent to help people, mainly from our congregation, but not entirely, with sometimes significantly large expenses. So it's to their credit that the Jerusalem church cared for the poor. But, like churches today, that first congregation wasn't perfect in that department. There was perceived injustice, inequity on the way that this money was being distributed. And it turns out that the reason there was inequity, well, I'm reading between the lines a bit here, but I think it's a fair conclusion, is that people who weren't gifted to work in that department were doing all the work for it. The key we learn from that, I think, is that in order for ministries to effectively work, people who are gifted in those ministries need to be staffing them. It's not good if a Bible study is led by somebody who doesn't like Bible study. It's not good if the music is led by someone who has never had any gifts of music. It's not good if people who are excellent at preaching decide that they're responsible for, well, I'll let you fill in the blank there. And so the leaders of the church, the 12 as they're called, the disciples who followed Jesus through his ministry, not counting Judas, but adding in Matthias, they added him to their number just in the very first chapter of the book of Acts, almost immediately after Jesus' ascension. Those 12 disciples who majored in preaching and prayer called a meeting. Now, meetings. Aren't you glad the text mentioned meetings? Over the years, the influence of the generations has affected the way we think about meetings. I think there was a time early in my ministry when meetings were seen as a very good thing. Now, I might have that idealized a bit, and I can remember some meetings that were not very good things way back when. I think today it's more often agreed that meetings are not usually a good thing. That meetings are kind of the thing that people would least like to do. And if you're under 35, you're, according to the surveys, more likely to think this. However, there is an in-between place, I think, for this, and there is a place for meetings. There are opportunities there to get people together on the same page. There are opportunities even before that to hear each other and to make wise decisions based on the fact that we know how people are feeling and what they're experiencing and what the facts of the matter are. The leaders called a meeting, and the congregation got together. The church met and talked about the complaint that had been raised. And of course, just before I go on to what happened next, let me just add that meetings, of course, can be positive or negative. Depending on the attitudes that we bring to them, they can be vastly different. Depending on the sense of community that has been built up in the particular group or committee or board that you work on, depending on the sense of agreement that we have as we envision our purpose and move forward, things can be very good or very bad. There can be seasons in a church's life when meetings can be the worst possible thing to have. Or, because of how hard the conflicts are, very difficult to deal with. Necessary to have those meetings, but important to push through them and to listen carefully and to make wise proposals, to hear the pros and cons about that proposal, and then to make a decision that we could all agree with and live with. Meetings have their place. So the church leaders in Jerusalem gathered all the believers together, we read, and said, the ones who had the problem, they said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. We have one task," they said, "and taking on this other task has resulted in negative outcomes. We're not doing it very well, I expect, they said. And we need others to help us who could do more effectively what we've been trying to do. We need people to handle the finances of this compassionate ministry. We need people who are willing to be on the front lines of our social care concerns and ministries. We're out of our depth here, I think they were saying, and we need help. Now, just before I make a main point about this, let me also add the fact that social and financial ministries on one hand and preaching and pastoral ministries on the other, the two groups that were kind of at odds there in Jerusalem, one kind of ministry is not better than another kind. They're equally valuable and important. It was entirely, I think, a matter of calling that was the problem here. That people who were good at one thing were not good at the other, and they needed help. And so they talk about it. They meet together. Let me not let that point pass for a minute. It's important for you and I to say, as we do our work together here at West End, I need help. It's important for us to do that, for us to say, I'm not able to do this on my own. I'm not able to do everything this committee has been charged to do on my own. I need help. That's why there's a committee, somebody might say. Or maybe even more charitably, they might say, how could I help you with that? I was sitting at my desk looking over these notes half an hour before the service began today, and I heard a voice from outside in the hall saying, can I help you with that? And I didn't go out to check, but I think that she really needed help with that. It was obvious. But she wasn't saying she needed help with that. And he helped with that. I recall one time a few months ago when one of our deacons came to me and said, you know that thing you're doing once a week? How's it going? Could I help you with that? I said, you sure could. She said, I'll do it. And a little bit of me said, but I'm in control of this one right now. The other part of me, the larger part of me said, be my guest. This is not my gifting. Take it on. And that job has worked a whole lot better since I gave it up. A lot better. So thank you. But you and I, in order for this kind of thing to work, in order for people to use the gifts they have to the best of their ability for God's service, you and I need to be serving in places where we are gifted and not so much in places we aren't. Now, ultimately, the things we sign up for include things we didn't sign up for. And that's true for those of you who volunteer for that, as well as those of us who are paid for that. And for those of us who are paid for it, there's less excuse not to say, aye, Captain, I'll do that. But in God's best scenario for the church, your gifting and mine should work together. I think God has promised gifts for a church. God has promised that as a congregation of his people look around, they will discover that God has given them the gifts they need to be the church. It might not be obvious sometimes, but usually it means that we just haven't asked or prayed enough about it. And time again, when I've thought, we do 6 things well and 2 things not so well, the reason we're not doing those 2 things so well is because we haven't been praying about them, and we haven't been asking God to show us who would do those things well, who would lead those ministries well. So the early church in Jerusalem chose 7 men from among their group, individuals who were known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom, meaning perhaps spiritually and practically minded. I can just write the scenario in my head that Peter, the preacher, was probably not very good at showing up at somebody's door and saying, "We had one Christmas basket left over." I'm kind of thinking Peter might have been a little too blunt, a little bit less concerned about the feelings of those students behind the door who really didn't have enough money and who did need the help of the church. Leave the preaching to him, but don't put him in that awkward position of using something that's different from his gifting. They chose 7 others. They're called the 7 later on. They turn out to be kind of a model for deacons, but that's just a story for another day. And their choosing led to a distribution of labor, to a new division of labor. Some who focused on preaching and prayer, and others who focused on administration. Preaching and prayer, others who focused on administration and social care. Everything fell into place. The motion passed unanimously at that meeting. Gifted individuals said yes to the new tasks, and they were commissioned for those responsibilities with prayer and the laying on of hands. You see, in the church, everybody cannot do everything. An individual, one person, cannot do it all. And an individual person is not called to all the tasks. There are some people who do too much. It's our responsibility as the church, as we care for that person, to say, "How could I help you?" People act outside their gifting, and it's our responsibility as a church to say, "Wouldn't this be better instead of that?" We need to allow others to use their gifts. And ideally, each person in the church should be not just simply attending church, they should be participating in the ministry and the mission of the church. That's the way it ought to be. God has given you a gift, perhaps more than one. And you will feel most satisfied when you're using that gift for God's purposes. We need to see, and often it's other people who can see the gifts in us better than we can. We need to speak into the lives of others as part of the discipleship that we operate in together, as part of the ways that we encourage each other to know God better and to serve Him more effectively. We need to say to others, "I see gifts of visitation in you. I see gifts of teaching in you. I see gifts of encouragement in you. And how could you be using that gift more effectively?" I've been amazed over the years to discover that the gifts or the tasks that I would think for me would be very unfulfilling turn out to be amazingly fulfilling for somebody else. And that's because the gifts fit the tasks. We need to be careful not to rank gifts and say, "Oh yes, this is more important than that. This person stands higher than that person." That's not true. That's not the way God intends it to be. In fact, as you and I each use the gifts that God has given us, we will all be equally important. As key to all important to the work of the church together. God calls different people to different ministries, and the church works best when we all realize that. Well, let me finish off with this. According to Acts 6, verse 7, the end of our passage, as a result of the decisions that were made that day, the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and even priests, Jewish priests, saw that Jesus was the Messiah, and they became obedient to the faith. This story begins and ends with the church growing. That's the ideal situation. We want that. We want more and more people to know Jesus, to be worshiping here with us. And as we follow God's patterns and instructions, as we use our gifts together, as you cooperate with a new senior pastor, as you work to be effective Christians within your committees and Bible studies and home groups and all the rest, the church will flourish. It will grow. The resolution of this matter in Acts chapter 6 brought renewed blessing to the church. And as the church works together and uses each person's gifts well, that will happen here too at West End. Amen.